Good morning and welcome to the Arts Audiences pre-application webinar. Just to let you know, we'll be starting in a couple of minutes. We are just waiting for a few more people to log on. Thank you very much.
We're on. Hello, everyone. This is Una Carmody here. I'm the Director of Arts Audiences, and you're very welcome. I hope a few of you have logged on in the last number of moments. This is the third webinar we've done this year, and we decided to try doing this pre-application workshop online. We've done them around the country in the past, and it's clearly tough for people to get there. So I hope this might serve as a new way of doing it. And we will be asking you for some feedback later on today. And we'd love to know what you thought and whether this was the right way to do it. The webinar is going to last, I would say, about an hour and 20 minutes. And there are three presentations. One in a moment is from Val Balance. Val is the head of venues in the Arts Council and also looks after the touring scheme. So Val is going to talk you through some of the just the broad principles around the scheme and also some information about how to apply. Then I will talk through some of the audience elements of your application and try and provide some advice about how you might go about answering some of what can be reasonably tricky questions. And then we're very grateful to Lara Hickey, who's associate producer at the Abbey Theatre, for coming along yesterday and today and providing a case study of tours that the Abbey has done and her experience of making applications and her top tips about how to do it. So I hope you find it useful. You can ask questions by looking at the pane on the right hand side of your screen. If you're on Google Hangout, some of you I know are watching on YouTube. Some people seem to prefer to watch on YouTube for some reason, but you can ask questions and we will answer them. And with that said, I am going to hand you over now to Val Balance, and Val is going to talk through, as I say, some of the elements of how to apply.
Great, thanks very much, Una. And I'm just going to put up here the guidelines for the scheme, which of course are available online. We have the touring scheme has been running now for since around 2010, and the broad principles of touring are, as we discovered from research that we carried out a couple of years before that first of all, that work that's touring in any art form has to be of the highest quality. But secondly, and most importantly, that it should have an audience focus. An audience focus means that you think about your audience. It doesn't mean that you have to have a very large number of people at every show or anything like it, but you do need to convince us that you've thought about who's going to look at the work and how you're going to optimize that audience. In other words, get at as many people as you possibly can in selling the show. So, and that involves working with the two main sides to any tour, and that is the producer and the presenter. So, as a way of ensuring that happens, that we do have a process of negotiation going on between the people involved, we ask people to produce what's called a memorandum of understanding. Now, it's not a contract, but it means that if you're making an application to the Arts Council, you need to convince us that every single place you go to is appropriate to the work that you're going to show, and that they are bought into what you're doing. So that's hugely important. The guidelines that you see on the screen there are at the beginning, there are general criteria which list more or less as I've just mentioned there. So we have proposals that are of high artistic quality, tours that generally have a strong audience focus, etc. So that's what I was talking about before. And then we go on to the priorities that we set, and these change quite frequently. Sometimes they change marginally, sometimes they change radically. In this round of touring, for anybody who's familiar with that, there are particular changes in work for young people, and you'll see that in the theatre guidelines. So you need to make sure that that what you're applying for is included in the priorities in the art form to which you're applying. Because it's a fairly competitive scheme. We generally get around about 4-to-1 of demand to available budget. So you're going to be in competition with other people, and you really need to be able to say that you are hitting the priorities in individual art forms, because we can only assess things on the basis of what we write down here. So, for example, I mentioned theatre there earlier on. In particular, we're saying in theatre, for instance, that hitherto you were able to apply for production costs, for instance, in putting a show together. Now we've said, no, you can't include production costs in your application, that you must. And that goes back to one of the basic principles of touring, which is that we really want to see work touring which has proven to be successful in advance. And that means that we will cover revival costs, but we don't want to fund an initial production. However, having said that we won't include, we won't allow you to include production costs. At the same time, we do want to know how you finance the initial production, so that we get a full picture of what it is that you're doing. So just remember that the it's a competitive scheme, and you need to be able to answer some of the priorities we've got. The current budget for touring, just to give you an idea of how that works, the current budget for touring in 2016 is 1.25 million. In national terms, that's a very limited amount of money. And it means that in each round of touring, there's 625,000 quid available. When you we divide that according to the way the Arts Council spends its overall budget. So it means that in the major art forms, I mean major in the amount of money that they use, or that they're allocated, it means that in music and theatre, you will have an overall budget of around about 200,000. So you can see that, with perhaps 60, 70, possibly 80 applications across all art areas, there's great pressure on those budgets. So you need to be aware of that. And we say that in the guidelines as well. You can apply for what you want, but bear in mind it's a limited budget. So you should do that. I should mention too that we arranged with the ACNI a couple of years ago, that's ACNI, the Arts Council of Northern Ireland, that we would work with them to allow people who wished to run tours in both Northern Ireland and in the Republic to apply to our scheme here, and then we would look after all of the administration for that. So if you wish, and we would strongly support the idea of touring in both jurisdictions, then you don't need to worry about applying to anyone else for the legs of a tour that might go to Northern Ireland. So just one date in one of the jurisdictions will count as going across the border. We're quite happy to support that. So I think that that covers the guidelines. When you make your application, I think it's kind of useful to show you the process that we use in assessing the application. Now, all I'm going to show you here is something that simply picks up the guidelines that you've hopefully already read, and we score your application according to that. And this is a form that we use. It's an internal form. You won't see it on our website or anything, but I think it's useful. I think when people see it in this format, they get a better idea of actually how the guidelines work. The Arts Council can only go on what it writes in the guidelines. We can't introduce criteria later on. We can't decide to prioritize or deprioritize. As in the process of an application, in process of an assessment, we publish our guidelines, we publish our criteria, and then we're bound to those ourselves. If we want to change them, we have to do it in due course. So if you have a look at this, you can see that there are three areas here, three areas in general. One is artistic merit. Second is meeting the objectives and priorities of the scheme. And thirdly is feasibility. So, and pretty well every application of the Arts Council is subject to those three areas. How good is the work artistically? It's always our principal concern. Secondly, we have strategies, we have priorities that this scheme is aimed to serve. How does your application meet those? So that's what I say about when I was talking about the guidelines. Have a look and see, is what you're trying to do a priority of the Arts Council? Because if it's not, you're going to struggle. So meeting the purpose and priorities of the award. And then finally, feasibility. Can you do it? And can you do it is, what kind of a track record have you got? Have you done this thing before? Does the budget look like it's something that is going to cover what it is required? People often ask, just as far as budget is concerned, can I put this cost in? Can I put that cost in? Remember, the Arts Council wants to support something that is going to work very, very well, where everybody is reasonably well remunerated from it. So in other words, if you say, if you're saying to yourself, well, perhaps if I make it that little bit cheaper, that that it might have a better chance of success, I would say that generally speaking, the answer to that is no, that's not the case. We want to see people being paid. We want to see you being paid, and you shouldn't stint on that, because it might well be that we would look at a budget and we'd say, well, no, that's not feasible. So that's the assessment. You can see that we simply put in a score for each area, and then we tot up that score, and then there's a kind of a process that we go through, and then we simply apply the budget to it, and we see how far down the list that we go. So generally speaking, in the major art forms of music, theatre, visual arts, perhaps would be the principal ones, bearing in mind that that young people don't have separate art areas. They apply to the art forms in which the work is taking place. That generally speaking is going to be quite a long list, and there's going to be very few of those funded. That's just the way it is. So, so then, if you're successful in your tour, then we offer the majority of the funding up front to allow you to plan your tour, and then we allow you to draw down the remaining 10% on production of things like audited accounts and a report. And the report then allows us to track how tours are doing. And we've been doing this now for the last 5 years, and we've been recording all of the data that we've collected from tours. So we know, first of all, how what are the targets in each tour, and then how those targets were met. So we record, for instance, we can take a particular one here. So let's say, well, we take the very first one here. So a grant of that amount there, 4,000. 4,000 incidentally would be a relatively low level of grant aid to a tour. The applicant had a target audience of 600, and then found that and then after the tour took place, having visited all the various venues that they went to, they had a total number of 426 paying for tickets, 137 comps, the box office was 3,000, etc., etc. And then we just track how that is. We're quite we publish some of this online, but I think it's very important to if you are applying to this, to make contact with the Arts Council beforehand. You got my name earlier on, Val Balance. I look after these touring schemes, and I manage them. I don't deal with the individual art forms. The individual art areas and managers deal with that. But I'm very happy to help you with any queries that you might have, as indeed will the arts manager be very happy to help you. And I think it's very important, to put any questions. You can just email them in. You will always get an answer. You always get an answer to a telephone call or an email or whatever. And I think it's very important for us to know about applications beforehand, so that we're familiar with what you're doing, and so that we can warn you about, well, if you're trying to do A and all our priorities are B, then we can tell you that you're going to struggle with that. Similarly, I look after the Arts Council's relationship with all of the Arts Council funded venues throughout the country. Now, of course, you don't have to tour to an Arts Council venue, but the ones that I know, I can certainly advise you about them. And there are plenty of them. There are 50 venues thereabouts throughout the country, and there's at least one in every county. They're generally speaking very well managed, professionally run, reasonably well resourced arts organizations that know your business very well. And I think it's very important that that you should know how to look at that infrastructure. You may not be familiar with it. I am very familiar with it, and I'm happy to advise you as to who might be interested in your work, for instance. So to save you running around all 50 venues, finding out that there's only half a dozen who are, I can maybe give you a shortcut to that. So feel free to get in touch with me. So I think that more or less covers what it is that I wanted to say. And as I say, feel free to get in touch at any time.
Great. That's thank you very much, Val. And I think the points that Val has made around really looking at the guidance and filling out and looking at the form and being clear about what the Arts Council is looking for, I guess, is one of the key points. So now I am going to talk you through some of the audience elements of the application, and really that's what we deal with, not necessarily the budgets, although I'll try and address some questions around marketing budgets. So here comes my presentation any moment. And it's probably worth saying that if there's anything that you feel wasn't, that if you want to listen to any of this again, the video will be up on YouTube after lunch. So this will be there for you to have another look at if there's anything that you'd like to go over again. Yep. So I am going to talk. Sorry, one sec. Oh, okay. So Val has gone through a bit about this particular scheme, and those are on the screen now. You will see the deadlines. The window for applications opens today if you're ready to submit your application today, and closes on the 3rd of December. And, oh, sorry, that's from yesterday. Okay, so the first thing I always say is that regardless of what I might say or what you might pick up, the main thing to do is to read the guidance that Val has referenced. The Arts Council puts a great deal of work into that and tries to be as clear as possible about what it is that they're looking for and what it is that you should do. And if you're in any doubt about whether, I may have said something that, contradicts the guidance is the Holy Grail. The guidance is the 10 Commandments, and that's what you should follow. Arts Audiences does a number of things around touring. We run a marketplace initiative, bringing together venues and producers once a year. We do these pre-application workshops in each round, and the purpose of them is really to try and ensure that when you get an award, you have the right things in place to be able to meet your target audience, or your planned audience as it's referred to in the application. We also do a program of training for people who are funded to tour. So if you do get an award of funding under the scheme, you will be offered free of charge marketing specifically in touring. And there are a number of resources. I've put up that list there, and I'll go through each of those, but I would refer you, because I'm not going to refer to it later on in the presentation, on our website, which is artsaudiences.ie. There is a downloadable tool called the Touring Marketing Map, and it talks you through how, step by step, what you need to do in order to market your tour. And it's a really useful tool which you will use if you get funding and you do the training that we provide. And Val has gone through some of this around the audience focus of the scheme. I'm going to cover some materials around how you might answer these 3 questions that are in the application. We are going to demonstrating how you demonstrate that your application meets the audience criteria. There are lots of criteria within the guidelines, but I only deal with the audience ones. A bit of guidance, I hope, about how to set an audience target, and also how to set a marketing budget. It's important, as Val has referenced, to say that each art form does have a slightly different set of criteria, and they're different around audience too. And here are some of examples. And you will see there, for instance, in literature, the focus is on, for instance, contemporary literature. And also there's a focus there on live performance. So what might you do? This is kind of a trickier question for me to help you with. And I suppose the most useful thing that I thought we could do is to show you some examples to give you some questions you might want to ask yourself, and also to show you some examples of how people have answered the questions and in successful applications. But the first and biggest point I would like to make is that for this question, and for all of the questions I'm going to cover, is that if you are touring to some of the network of venues that Val talked about, it's really important to ask all of these questions and have a discussion with the venues that you're proposing to tour to. They will have a lot of information around audiences. Do they have an audience for what you want to do? Or indeed, is there a gap in their program which you might be able to fill? Do you know people who've tried to tour something similar to what you're proposing to do before? And there's no substitute in this instance for talking to other people about their experience. And those are some links to some of the reports that we have produced that might be of help. And there is also an information resource on the venue section of the Arts Council website. So the Arts in Irish Life is a big report that we produced and published at the beginning of this year. And it breaks down what kinds of audiences exist in different regions for different art forms. And some of this I know people have used as backup information to persuade venues about the tour, and to be able to demonstrate that there is an audience for the art form you're proposing to tour there. And some of that in a different report called Arts Attendance in Ireland 2013, and these are all on the same section of the website. There is a lot of useful information. This chart, which I've mistakenly highlighted, shows you in thousands what the reported audience is, so what people say they do, for each of those art forms. So you can see there that, for instance, for classical music, there are 134,000 people in Dublin who say that they attended classical music once a year or more than that. And the same figures for each of the regions you can see there. It's important just to say on that chart where it says all Irish adults down the bottom, that's for the purposes of comparison. So that's not adding up, if you like, the figures above. So here are some examples of good applications from a few of the art forms. And this slide just concentrates on some of the things that people have said if they're applying in theatre. And the first one says, as you can see, that the company has an excellent track record in touring quality productions nationally. And it's really important, I think, to advise people to state the obvious. Don't be afraid to say who you are, what you've done in the past. You may think that, whoever's reading your application in the Arts Council knows everything about you already, or that things are implicit in what you may have said in your plan or in your budget, but that's not necessarily the case. And something like this, which talks about track record, which is one of the key criteria in theatre, it's important to say what it is that you've done previously. And there you can see another one that says the production has had a previous life, receiving strong reviews and an excellent audience response. And again, that may sound terribly obvious, but in terms of the Arts Council's priorities, this is a key point. And then at the last one there talks about the company and the venues feel that this production will get a high audience turnout. And that idea of venue buy-in is really important too. In music, this is an example where the applicant was saying that they were proposing to tour a major artist in intimate venues. So they were trying to do something, I think, a little bit different, playing a very, very significant artist, but in smaller venues where the audience would have a very distinctive experience. And they made that point very clearly. And in film, the priorities, for instance, can mention things like mediation of programs. So not just programming films, but also contextualizing those films by means of talks or lectures or things that may be published around the film. And there's an example of an application which succeeded. Now I'm going to talk a bit about how you would go about, or some advice about how you might go about setting an audience target. And as I've said in the application, it's referred to as planned audience. So our experience in arts audiences, and I think Val would bear this out from the Arts Council's perspective, is that overestimation of audience numbers is the norm. And we would suggest to people very strongly that they just don't do it. We also always say that targets should be realistic, so based on evidence about previous audiences for performances or for exhibitions or whatever it is that you're doing, but also be ambitious. So you shouldn't limit yourself to the size of previous audience. And of course, a very important point is that if you do have co-promoters, that you have agreed these targets and everyone is on board with saying these can be achieved and we will all work hard to achieve them. So one of the things I'm going to show you is the averages for touring in the past, and the figures we're going to look at are from 2012 to 14. And it's really important to say that these are guideline figures only. So I would really strongly suggest that you don't copy these numbers into your application. It's from a relatively small sample of tours, and there are reasons in each art form for numbers to be taken with some caution. And of course, they're averages. So if you look at the theatre number there, the average is that 121 people attended per performance. This is at theatre performances. But that average, of course, could have been arrived at by, you know, a performance that had 1,000 people and a performance that had 10 people. So an average, I suspect there was never a theatre performance that had exactly 121 people in it. Nevertheless, they are averages, and they do show quite clearly the kinds of numbers that people are achieving. And so that's one of the things that we would ask you to consider in looking at your target. Okay, so I would say the first thing, and I've mentioned this before in terms of looking at how you're going to set your target, is to talk to the venues and ask them about what they think, and that will be based on what they've achieved in the recent past for similar things. Use the information resources that are available, and there are, as Val talked about, the results of the touring and dissemination of work scheme up to now, and you can contact Val or you can contact the relevant arts manager in the Arts Council. There are various published reports such as Arts Attendance in Ireland, which will give you a sense of the numbers of people who say they're interested in your art form in a region. There are the highlights of the census. There's a little booklet online called This is Ireland. And the Theatre Forum benchmarking study can be really, really helpful. If you're going to venues that participate in that, they should be able to give it to you. Okay, this is a kind of magic tool, which I'm now going to try and access, called Mapping Your Audience. And this was commissioned by the Arts Council from the All Ireland Research Observatory, and brought out late last year, I think, was when it was launched. Oh, sorry, it takes a little while for the system to get onto the website. Or sorry, to catch up with what I'm looking at on the screen. Essentially what the Mapping Your Audience tool, if you're not familiar with it already, what it does is the AIRO took information from the census and also took a list of, I think there are just about 70 venues around Ireland, and looked to analyse the catchment area or the numbers of people by a variety of different methods. Here we are, by a variety of different metrics, looked to analyse that audience in a variety of ways. So if you can see there's the list. It's very easy to use. And I'm going to look at the Everyman Theatre in Cork, I hope. That hasn't worked. Bear with me one sec. Well, that's what it looks like. And you can see there, we're looking at the Greenon Theatre. Are we? And is this the screen that people can see? Okay, so you can see there that we're looking at Greenon. And I'm hoping this is going to work now. There's the Everyman Theatre. And this is the total population of Cork City that you can see. And you can actually choose to filter the population in a variety of different ways. So for the purposes of this, I'm going to look at women. And you can ask it also, at the moment we're looking at the percentages. So the population of Cork City, there 15.8% of the population live within a 10-minute drive time of the Everyman. But actually what I want to look at is what's called individual catchment, because this is going to give me the actual numbers. So I can see there that there are 25,049 people within a 30-minute drive time of the Everyman who are between the ages of 0 and 14. And for the purposes of a lot of what we might be doing, it's really important to look, for instance, at these numbers for where the population might be a bit older. Okay, so I'm going to come out of this now and go back to my presentation. You can play around with this in a variety of ways, and it's a really, really useful and very interesting tool. Yesterday we looked at the Abbey Theatre when we did this workshop in the Abbey. And we would also say to you, if the venue you're going to go to, or if you're working or with a venue who's not on the list, and there are lots of them, I would suggest you just choose one nearby. So I would then suggest that you would try and put the different sources of information together. Arts Attendance in Ireland will tell you how many attenders there are in a region for an art form. The Arts in Irish Life can tell you information about gender breakdown or a lot of other ways of looking at it. And Mapping Your Audience, for instance, can tell you how many females, as we looked at, there are within a drive time. And previous touring averages can then help you to look at what's a reasonable number of attendees. So this is just a short example. If you were going to look at doing a classical music concert in the Everyman, the average audience achieved for music on tour is 108 people. Arts Attendance in Ireland shows that 60% of classical music attenders are women, compared to 51% of the population. So there's a slight female bias for classical music. And 51% of classical music attenders are over 55. And that's only 27% of the population is over 55. So that's quite a big skew towards older people. And there are 74,000 people who say they attend classical music in Munster. So if you were to take all of those figures together and talk to the venue, you could start to look at coming up with a realistic and ambitious audience target. What I would also say to you in looking at your target is I would advise against using a blanket percentage of capacity. A lot of times people in coming up with their targets just say, we'll get 50%, or 60% capacity or whatever. But I would say myself that a venue by venue calculation is more realistic. Different venues have audiences for different things. A lot of people find when they tour that a show can do really well in one venue and much, much less well somewhere else. So they are not all the same. The important thing is to agree your planned audience with the venue or venues, and you'll have to do that when you look at the documentation, including the memo of understanding that the Arts Council wants you to fill out, or needs you to fill out. You can attach the workings of how you've arrived at your planned audience to your application. And I also think it's really, really important for the applicant to be really heavily involved in both planning the audience and achieving those targets. You're the person who gets the funding. You're the person who will submit the report after the tour. So even in circumstances where the venues, say, are doing the majority of the marketing, it's important that you are confident about the planned audience. So remember, try to be realistic, but ambitious. So now we're going to move on to how you might set a marketing budget. I'm going to go through this, and then we have a few questions and we'll deal with those after that. So the marketing budget normally needs a marketing plan, but I would, generally speaking, say that an application, you may not wish to go down the road of producing a really detailed marketing plan for an application, although I see that on this round, in theatre specifically, they are looking for more detail around your marketing and audiences. So how do you ensure that you have allowed enough for marketing? And again, I'm going to say you're responsible for these audience numbers. You're the person who's been given the grant, and you're the person who's going to have to fill out the report and say that hopefully that you hit your audience target. So the first thing I'd say is you need to agree an outline marketing agreement with the venue about, generally speaking, who's doing what. And what will you have to provide, and therefore what will you need to pay for? And even again, in circumstances where, for instance, the venues are doing the marketing for the show, they will still expect that you're able to provide them with basics of marketing. Typically things like images, good quality text, logos, and more often now, short videos and trailers for their website and audio materials. There's a good list of all of this in one of the documents I talked about called The Guide to Marketing Your Production on Tour. It was produced for us by Heather Maitland in the UK, but also by Cushcame Dance Theatre, based on a tour that they did 3 years ago now, I think. But it's got a huge amount of detail and really interesting about how you could, the kinds of things that you will need to provide. I would also suggest that you, unless you do this, unless you're a marketing person and you do this for every day, I would get some prices for those elements and don't just guess, don't just say, I'll allow 200 euros for photography. Sometimes those things, if you've got an unusual idea or whatever, they can cost more than you might imagine. And then very importantly, we always say in your marketing budget, allow some travel and familiarization money, by which I mean literally the price of a train ticket or the price of, the petrol to get you around the country. Everybody in the venues always says to us that it's really important that they know what you look like and that they know something about your show. And we really strongly suggest to people that they travel, go to the venues, meet the box office managers, talk to them about the show, and make sure that they know what it is that you're doing and just how good it is. Sometimes people do it the other way around. Last Christmas, the ARC and Music Network put on a show, and they brought all the venue marketing managers and box office managers to Dublin to see some of the rehearsals, which was a nice, interesting way of doing the familiarization too. This is an extract from that guide I was talking about how to set your marketing budget. And there's more detail than this in the report, but it talks about some of the factors that will influence the size of your budget. So, things that may seem really obvious, like the size of venues, but bigger venues do need more marketing materials. The type of event you're planning on touring, the new or challenging work does need more money and more time. And like I referenced earlier, whether or not a particular venue has a history of programming the kind of work that you're doing. If they don't, then it's going to be a harder sell and will need a bit more welly behind it. The other thing for you to bear in mind is that the biggest cost to your company will be the time to carry out the marketing tasks involved. And again, if you have thought about all of the things you're going to do for your marketing, it may be worth thinking about having somebody, bringing somebody in specifically for a short contract to do the marketing for you. And excluding their salaries, most venues spend about 5% of their turnover on marketing, but touring companies average around 9 or 10%. So again, I offer that as an average. It is not to say that you should, start saying, oh, well, 10% of my overall budget is going to be for marketing. But what I would say to you is that it's just a benchmark for you to use in looking at what percentage of spend you're planning to spend on marketing. If you find that your marketing budget is 2% of your overall budget, you might want to look at that again, or you would want to be really, really, really sure that there's a good reason for that. And there are some costs that you will incur even if the venues are doing the marketing for you. There's a lot of material around all of this in the guide, including some really good advice about what press packs need to contain, how to make materials for the website. And again, the other possible costs are you may wish to hire a PR professional for the tour. That's quite common again, even in circumstances where the venues are doing the marketing, and they will generally expect that you will provide printed materials, flyers and posters. And then the last thing to talk about is if you are doing the marketing for your own tour, you need to then start looking at what marketing channels does the audience for your art form respond to. For the venue particularly, and they can advise you on that, and for your art form. What will you concentrate on? Newspapers, radio, online, and how many people can you reach by virtue of those channels? Obviously, we would all love to do everything, but it's just simply not possible within the budgets to utilize all of those channels. And then I just sound a slight note of caution in terms of social media. A lot of the time people say, oh, I'll do all my marketing on Facebook or on Twitter. And they are brilliant. And I'm not suggesting people ignore them, but they're rarely enough on their own. They're attractive to a lot of people because a lot of it is free. But they're rarely enough on their own. You need to think about how you will use those as part of an overall marketing mix. And again, the outline cost, the rule of thumb is between 9 and 10% of your budget should be spent on marketing. And these are all of this is just, I hope, a useful checklist so that you can think about all of the different elements. What we see typically when people turn up for the training that we do, less so now, but still it's there, is that people have applied to the touring scheme and they have overestimated the audience that they will achieve, and they have underestimated the amount of money that they will need for marketing in order to achieve their planned audience. And really what we're trying to get at in telling you and giving you this advice is to say, if you get these two things right, it really will stand to you when you get funded. You have done some of the work, you have got a solid basis to work from, and you are in a position, hopefully, to be able to report after the tour to the Arts Council that you have met or exceeded your target instead of missing the target. I do realise, and I always say this to people, it's an awful lot of work, but unfortunately, that is, generally speaking, just tough. And like I say, it is worth it. And I hope Lara, when she talks to you about the Abbey, will agree. It's the kind of work that if you've done it once, you don't ever have to go back and do all of the same degree of detail again. You've got a better sense of where to go for information. And obviously, we're here. If you have questions about where you might find specific things, we will do our very best to answer them. Okay, we have a question around, and the question is, would the Arts Council consider a touring exhibition that includes international artists? And the answer is yes. Now, what I would suggest to you is that you, again, go back to the Arts Council's guidance for visual art. But in specific areas, they're very keen to allow for work to be seen around Ireland, which would not normally or not otherwise be seen by our Irish audiences. So that is not by any means a limiting factor. People do sometimes ask if the scheme also covers touring outside Ireland, but that's not the case. So tours outside Ireland are funded by Culture Ireland. I'm going to hand you over now to Lara. And Lara, as I mentioned, works with the Abbey Theatre and runs their touring. And so she's one of the most experienced people and one of the few people, as she says herself, who really do this for a living. And I hope you find it interesting. She'll be with you now in 1 second. There's a slight delay with the slides. Okay. And Lara's going to just talk to you briefly about the Abbey's experience of touring and applying to the scheme, and give you, I hope, some top tips about how to work it.
Thanks, Una. I hope everybody can hear me. Hi, I'm Lara Hickey, Associate Producer at the Abbey Theatre, Ireland's National Theatre. I work specifically in the area of touring. So that's both nationally and internationally. I sort of line manage and produce the tours that the Abbey takes out on the road. I also work a little bit with our visiting companies, so independent theatre companies, both Irish and international, that we invite into the Abbey. So I kind of have a little bit of a knowledge of the other side of the coin from a venue and presenting perspective as well. So just to give you a little background, I've been working at the Abbey for just over 3 years, and it was a new role when I began in order to develop a particular touring strategy. So it's been a lot of work over the years to try and sort of get familiar with the landscape and with different venues and build those relationships and develop a sort of a regularity and a strategic approach to how the Abbey might tour, and then also how touring networks in the country might work. So a few health warnings, I suppose, before I start. Firstly, I haven't done a PowerPoint presentation since college, so I'm not sure how brilliant or effective it is, but I added pictures, so I thought that was good. Also, just to say, I'm very aware that I'm speaking from the perspective of the highest funded theatre by a long shot in the theatre community and industry in Ireland. So I'm aware that I have, my position is full-time, so I am actually paid and tasked with filling in applications. I'm aware of how much work the applications are, especially if you're freelancing or you're not funded for your time there. So I'm hoping that I can sort of give a general overview and give a sense of what the challenges are that we all share in putting together these applications and in planning our tours. So yeah, I'm going to try and use examples from, just to say, we tour inside and outside of the Arts Council grant schemes. So some of our smaller scale works, such as our beautiful one-man show, Maeve's House by Eamon Morrissey, and some of our community education work for primary schools, so Me Malzer and Me Michael. We tour outside of Arts Council grants, but then in the last few years, the tours you might be familiar with that we received Arts Council funding for are in 2012, The Play on the Stars, which was the first tour that I worked on. Quietly in 2014, Owen McCafferty's really brilliant piece of writing about Belfast, and then Sive also last year, which went on an 11 venue national tour, both north and south of the border in the autumn. We also have just been awarded a grant for The Play on the Stars in 2016 as part of the centenary celebrations. So just to give you an overview in case you've seen any of those shows. I will be taking a very practical approach today. Of course, you want to be making the best artistic and creative case for your work in your application, but I am going to take the approach of sort of how do we tick the boxes that are required, like trying to maximize your points in the Leaving Cert rather than writing a really beautiful essay about Hamlet. So do put questions on the Hangout, or so that I can answer any of them later on. Just to say in advance as well, it's important to consider the landscape and context every time you're making planning a tour or making a funding application. The funding landscape changes all the time and the infrastructure changes all the time. The application process changes a lot and has different requirements. And then there's different local contexts as well. So for example, local authority funding, who's been awarded that, who's gotten a funding cut, how people are doing is a very important sort of part of it. So yeah, if we're just going to get the slides going there. Okay, so what I'll say today, I just gave a long-winded introduction there. So I'm just going to start by some advice about knowing your stuff. I'll then do a sort of a whistle-stop tour of the application. All the information that Val and Una have already given you is incredibly important. So I think I'm just going to take it from the perspective of things I've done that have worked and things I've done that have not worked, and sort of my advice, having done quite a few of them in short succession and quick succession now over the last few years. Moving to... So knowing your stuff. Knowing your stuff is incredibly important. Going into any application process, it's about knowing everything backwards. So how do I write a successful application? Knowledge is power. Be familiar with the application aims, objectives, criteria, and processes. So I can't emphasize enough how important the guidelines are. I'm looking in front of me at my guidelines I've printed out for the application in December, and I have highlighted and scribbled on them and circled things to remember them, and just to really make sure my application is relevant, it meets their objectives, meets the criteria, or how can I make it do that if that's what I need to do. So what are the Arts Council objectives? Does my project meet those objectives, and how does it meet those objectives? They have very specific objectives. So as Val went through there, the objectives change every year. So don't use your old guidelines, reprint the guidelines. I have been caught out really badly in the past. For example, Una mentioned that you now need to submit more detail on your audience targets, which have been agreed with the venues. And I nearly didn't do that for my last application, as I wasn't fully aware I needed them and hadn't read the guidelines properly. So there's these things that happen. Also, in particular with regards to theatre, the budgets are getting ever more expansive, and at the moment you now need to fill in your MOU summary, which is on the second tab in the budget template, just in case anybody misses that one. It's a tricky one. So just to say that the guidelines are your guide, and to keep them, I keep it on my desk beside me while I'm doing it, so I make sure to get everything. So knowing your stuff, know your product. So you only have a short space of time to explain what you're actually trying to do. You need to explain it artistically, practically, logistically, in a lot of different ways. So you need to know it backwards. You need to know what you're doing and why. You need to be able to articulate it about what you're doing specifically with this show, but also about who you are and who your team are. Know who your current audience are, and this is something Una would have talked about a lot. Having target audiences, who are your existing audience, who would you like to make your new audience, and in conjunction with the venues, then how that might tie in with what they're doing in terms of audience development. And then how do you plan to reach them is sort of like who and how is really what you need to know. Even at application stage, it's something that you have to think about now. And as Una was saying, it's a lot of work in advance, but actually makes your tour a lot easier than later if you do get the funding. So know your country. Where do you want to tour to and why? This is something really important that we've been working on the last few years. You know, as Val says, there are many venues and every venues are different. There are 32 counties in Ireland, north and south. So as you know, the ACNI and the Arts Council do a joint funding scheme. You only need one in each in order to apply. There are over 54 existing arts venues, too many festivals to count, and many more alternative spaces or unusual spaces, and actually many more smaller town halls and things like that. So there's a lot of different places you could be going. The sizes, so everything varies wildly in terms of size, scale, resource, funding, location, programming style, art form preference, audience, all of that. They have regular audiences, they know their audiences. You need to know what your aim is in order to make good decisions about that. So the application itself. So I'm going to take you through the various sections of the application and hopefully with some advice on how things have gone for us in the past. So there's our poster of SIVE, which went on that tour at the end of last year, which was hugely successful in terms of audiences, and did have a few big sellout venues. The only thing I'd say about that is it did involve a huge amount of work. I mean, SIVE, as you know, it's a known title, not so much internationally actually, but nationally, it's the number one thing you could tour in Ireland to get audiences. However, it required a huge amount of marketing and support behind it to really get the word out there, and a huge amount of momentum behind that tour. So it still does require, even with a title, a lot of work. But let's just see. So we've got guidelines, application form, supporting documentation, budget, financial deal, and audience. We can go through those. So in terms of the guidelines, I've already just said, you know, they're really what you need to be looking at and reading. So the answer is in the question. I mean, I'd advise using their language back to them. So read, reread, use as a reference, and final checklist. The language they use about their aims and objectives, they want you to use that back to them. I mean, it's a guideline for how to fill out your application form, not just about touring. There's an emphasis on evidence, particularly in theatre, but I think in all art forms. So providing proof to support each statement made in the application form and to meet each of the criteria. So, I mean, it's incredibly important that in the guidelines, they expressly say the things you must provide. But if you are making any claims in the application overall, there should be a piece of paper to support it. So saying this was a critically acclaimed piece of work, show the critical acclaim, you know, a press pack, PDF. I know Una was talking about different ways of presenting those. Consider the timeline as well. The guidelines lay out a few things like if you don't have an artist's number already with the Arts Council, it can take 5 working days to get that. You know, keep in mind the deadline and the timelines of how long these things put together. If you look at the guidelines and see how much work it is and work backwards from the deadline date, you can see that it's at a minimum of 6 weeks if you already know what your project is and if you already know where you want to tour to and have had conversations. So it's quite far out. The application form itself, this is key to your application. Put yourself in the Arts Council shoes. So when they meet and have their panels, they they read all the supporting material, and I've just said, give evidence and support every statement in the application form with evidence. However, they will probably only read that, if you think about it, once, maybe have a glance over before the meeting again. In that meeting, they're sitting there with your application form in front of them. It's the summary of everything. It has your name on it. It has the details and the basic numbers that they need to know about. They will probably have investigated the rest of it, but there's so many applications that really you need to be summarizing yourself effectively, clearly, and be bold in how you're working with that. The other thing that how that ties into what Val was saying in terms of the internal document he showed about how they score and mark different things. So that's what they'll be looking at as well. So it's really about showing and proving and having evidence to back up everything you're claiming, but really you need to make sure that application form has everything. Don't rely on them having looked at every single piece of supporting documentation in detail. So, clarity is extremely important. It's not a marketing document. It's unfortunately not as much of an artistic statement as maybe we feel it should be. It's about sort of creatively being clear and bold and ambitious in the way you're pointing something out. Structure really is your friend. The bullet point helps. When you're looking at word counts or character, the form is extremely restrictive. It's character count including spaces, so you really have to be economical in how you use your language there, especially if you're doing something complicated with community and education aspects, with several different art forms, several different locations, so the bullet point is good, and little infographics like that are quite nice as well. So that's something that we developed to show, to give a narrative sense of what the tour would look like or does look like. So that's a good one. So the supporting documentation. So as I said, there are required documents and there are things, the way that the Arts Council works, and it's sort of useful in some ways, but really tricky and really needs to be kept in mind, is that if you don't submit something required, your application is immediately sort of null and void, because they're quite strict on both the deadlines and the requirements. They have to be like that in order to make sure that a certain standard is being met in the applications and therefore in the projects. So make sure you've submitted the required documents. Budget for theatre applications is particularly important. And as I said before about the guidelines, these change every year. Print them off, go through it, highlight it, list out the things for yourself that you need to and make sure reread it. Support every claim you make in the application form as a document for evidence. So I've already gone over that in terms of, one of the big things for Quietly, for example. When I made the application for Quietly, we hadn't yet gone to Edinburgh. And so we didn't have the sort of as much critical acclaim and the awards that we later got from our fantastic run at the Traverse in Edinburgh. So one of the things I had to do was, sort of brilliant language in the application form about it. This is an incredible, important piece of work, and with a great writer and a fantastic team, and it got a great result. Being very honest, it didn't do brilliantly at the box office in the Abbey. So I didn't have a claim to make about sellout, smash hit success. So I needed to know how I was going to explain that this was a very excellent, very good piece of work. Now, we did have some good reviews, but I needed to sort of write a piece about it in the application form and then show how it was. So we used things like, we storified comments on Twitter and different articles that were written about it. There was a great wrap up at the end of the year where Peter Crawley mentioned it in glowing terms, and really highlighting that. But it was a lot of work to put that together to make it a convincing argument in the face of something that's a piece of new work. It's, Owen McCafferty's work wasn't that well known in Dublin, around the country. It was kind of something that needed a lot of work to show. And I think that happens across the board with different art forms and different levels of funding in organizations, and also different levels of experience. And there's a lot of talk about track record, and it's about how you show that to them in the context of the application. So the supporting documents is where you can do that. You can also do things like, if you do feel that there needs to be more support from, say, the artistic end of things. What I've done in the past is asked for artist statements from the various people involved. So a really great thing I think that massively supports the application is to get the director, the writer, a cast member, a member of the design team, and also, the artistic director, like I've often asked Fiach, to extol on why this piece of work is important and why about touring it nationally. We've had some great pieces from Conal Morrison, wrote us a great piece for the SIVE application. So I think things like that, this is where you can really show your sort of flair and your ideas behind things. Be tidy sounds like a really boring point. Label things clearly and amalgamate where possible. Clear layout is key. So, I mean, you need to label it press pack, name of the show, name of the company, Arts Council application, maybe even the date. Amalgamating several different documents into the one PDF document is really handy, helps in your upload. It's not messy and it's much easier for them to have a clear sort of pack. It also, belies a strategic mind and somebody who's thinking in a way that would really help in terms of planning a tour, which needs this type of overview sort of mentality. And the other thing is, I've already mentioned, the deadline is the deadline. It's incredibly strict. Uploading documents can take a lot longer than downloading them. It's an incredibly tight deadline. If you're late, and it won't be accepted no matter how brilliant your application is. So the budget. This, I suppose, is most significantly a most significant part of the application for the theatre people, but it applies to everybody. I am a sort of a bit of a budget nerd and an Excel nerd about things, and I really think that it's a fantastic tool, but not just in order to keep track of your spending. I mean, the budget should really be the project plan, and it should tell the story of your tour. So it's a narrative. So it's not only a way that you can manage your tour correctly, but it's a way of you displaying your ability to manage a tour and your knowledge of what a tour might require. One of the big major things, and you saw it in Val's presentation about how they assess the applications. Feasibility is one of the 3 major criteria. This is especially important if you're lesser known or you're not known to have, say, the Abbey have a production department, so they do have an awareness that we're able to produce something like that. But if you're less well known, it's really key to show that you know what feasibility is, know what is feasible, and that you can communicate it in your budget. So the budget is where you show that. In particular, something that feeds into this is your showing of in-kind support. Always include this as an expenditure and revenue, so it balances out. But I would always include it, if you're saying, oh, I didn't put the transport in for the tour because my uncle has a van and we're using that, that looks to the Arts Council like you don't know you need transport for your set, so you want to be making sure that you're covering all your bases and you're being very clear that you've thought this all through. It's a really important one. I mean, it happens a lot. I try to represent things that we obviously provide in-house at the Abbey that's full-time, but I try to put it into the budget as much as I can to show how much it takes to plan these things and how much of an investment everybody's making in it. Keep in mind about the budget that you can submit your own budget in addition to the template. We do this every single time. The template is excellent and actually an excellent way of learning to produce a tour. It's a brilliant guide in terms of exactly what you need, and maybe you haven't thought about this category or that category, or have you thought about crew for this particular area. It's actually brilliant. But we sort of do very detailed budgets and might have something, it might give an even better picture of what our tour plans are. So I often submit my own budget as well. In addition to that, or sort of instead of that, you could submit notes on your budget. So just to be clear about what you mean, there was a few questions yesterday in the Abbey about, sometimes you have to insert a figure that's maybe an amalgamation of different figures or adding up figures. There's no harm in saying, there's a note on this, and just to say to note this was adding up various figures for various reasons. So there's no problem with that. The financial deal, this is the area that I feel like has changed the most since I've started doing this, and changes all the time. So even I've given a sample deal here, but even this actually has been changing recently in how I've been talking to venues. So the memo of understanding is the template for the financial conversation with each venue. When you call the venue to talk to them about the tour, have the memo of understanding in front of you. Those are the questions you need to answer and ask and fill out, and that's the shape of the conversation you need to have. So there's a number of different things. Know the cost of your work per week, per performance, per day, whatever length of time or unit you sell it in. Know the cost of your work inside out. Know if there are any areas you can reduce the cost, or if there are not. Know if any particular features of the venue might increase the cost for you, and know of all those restrictions in advance. So really, it needs to be a very informed conversation with that venue in order to save time and not annoy people. I find, venues are fantastic to talk to when you're clear and they're clear. They say to you, we can only get 100 people in for that show. You say, my show costs €1,000 a night, or whatever it is. You need to just be really, really clear, and nobody minds a high cost. They just mind a lack of clarity, really. They do mind a high cost as well, but just the clarity on it would help with your high cost. So knowing the cost of your work, then the structure of the deal and the way the conversation should work in terms of the memo of understanding is about talking to the venue. What is their capacity? what is their realistic audience? So audience, particular thing I might talk about in a second, but it has to be based on what their earning capacity is, and you go from there in terms of a conversation. So this structure here is sort of a suggestion, and it's the basis on which I always start the conversation. So that first call of a writer's royalty at 10% of the net box office is a non-negotiable. I know that actually in different groups, like in dance, there often isn't a royalty paid. It's up to you yourselves in terms of whatever your arrangement is with your artists. For us in sort of literary theatre, I guess, the writer is incredibly important, or royalty pooling between writer and creator, or however that works. The second call of a guarantee to the company, I do think deals need to favour the artist, but I understand that venues are in a difficult position. Something I actually said at the beginning of my talk yesterday that I didn't say today, but is I think quite important, is in terms of the landscape that I mentioned earlier, it's important to recognize that in a landscape where almost everything has been cut either by 40% in the last few years, I know the Abbey certainly have, and a lot of venues have, or cut completely, or lost their local authority funding, or whatever it is, the venues are often not funded to program fully. They're funded to operate as a building physically, but they're not necessarily funded to program. So they don't have a huge amount of disposable income, as it were, to be buying the various different shows. The companies, by and large, are also not funded to tour as part of their core funding. Not even the Abbey is, technically, which is why we can apply for this grant. So it's actually incredibly tricky, because you're having a conversation between yourselves and venues. Neither of you are actually funded to do this work. So you're trying to make it work in some way, sharing the risk, agreeing what you can and cannot do, agreeing audience numbers. So that's why this is also the audience conversation so important. I do think it should favour the artist, because the artist is bringing the creative work to the venue. So a second call on guarantee to the company needs to be linked into your conversation around capacity, ticket yield, financial capacity. Third call, cost to the venue. The venue has costs in terms of operating and opening the doors, and they need to be met to a certain extent as well. And the fourth call, a box office split, which should always be in favour of the company. I would avoid 50-50. I mean, I think 70-30 or 80-20 is ideal. But there should always be some recognition of the show doing well at the end. People should benefit from that. One thing I've noticed is that this deal has started to alter a little bit in terms of I've started to talk to venues who are, we're all struggling. I've started to talk to them who are talking about splitting the risk a little more. So maybe adding to these calls, first call writer's royalty, second call a guarantee of a certain amount, a third call of cost to the venue, another guaranteed amount to the company, and the same back and forth. So that's particularly applicable with the larger venues, because the capacities are bigger and the earning capacity is bigger. But it applies in general. And I mean, it's just about figuring out where your parameters are going into that conversation, and letting the venue know your clear boundaries in terms of what you can and cannot offer. In terms of those audience figures as well, I would just say be realistic. The Arts Council do not want inflated figures. So this is something Una touched on and Val touched on as well. When they say audience focus, they don't mean populist, commercial, or that we need to sell out. That's not what they mean. What they mean is they want you to know about your audience and be aware of your audience and be realistic about it in partnership with your venue. So it's about having specific knowledge of your show and what is appealing about your show, and then the venue having specific knowledge about their audience and their locality, and you guys marrying that to come up with a number that you think is realistic, not too ambitious. So just to say, there's some examples here about the Abbey on Tour that I'll talk about, but just to say something briefly about audiences and how important that conversation is. I mean, with something like Quietly, which is a piece of new work, I really had to push the venues in my conversations with them to be a little more ambitious with the targets. That was because they didn't have a huge amount of familiarity with the work, and I did, and I was more confident that it could sell more tickets. Although in different areas, it definitely is different. So the result in that was, there was a couple of venues where we came in far below the target, which is me being ambitious and possibly not heeding as much as I should have the venue's advice. But, at the same time, I had to push, and it's about pushing it in order to achieve those targets and set targets so that we're ambitious in the way we actually work it and market it. But it's also about putting a value on your show as well, which can be the temptation. With Sive, it was a very different conversation. And to be honest, I felt I was the one curtailing the estimates on Sive, because what I didn't want to happen was go, it's Sive, it's John B. Keane, it's around the country, I'll sell out every single ticket at a €35 rate, and then we'll have all the money. And then if I budgeted my tour on that basis, I would be shot by the Director of Finance Administration in the Abbey. So we actually had to curtail, which meant we exceeded targets in most places, and it was actually a really fantastic feeling for everybody involved. So the other thing is, I think Una was mentioning about percentages and numbers, really taking a generic percentage when estimating these things is really not a good idea, because it's more important to talk about numbers per night, and that's a more realistic, particularly because people have such good local knowledge about their venues. They know the 100 people that might come to the show that night, so trust them because they really do know that. So the only thing I will say is that yeah, I've kind of already mentioned it, but just in recent years, the biggest change has been this focus on audiences. And I suppose it's important not to misunderstand that as a reductive sort of policy to, make work more, I don't know, funnier or more commercial, or that more entertaining. So just to say on this slide here, I have, as you know, I've talked to Quietly in Sive, and we'll be touring the Play on the Stars next year, which has a big schools element. We have had some unsuccessful applications that I don't mind sharing with you. Now, Shush and the Waste Ground Party is just really, really important to get your feedback from the Arts Council. So when Val showed you his scoring template, that's actually what you get from them. So you get a comment on every section, and you get a score for every section, and you get a final decision and the reason for the backup. And actually, they're very honest, and it's very helpful, and they're very kind. It's not sort of saying this is crap, and that's, it's a really, really helpful thing in planning tours for the future. So, for example, some things for Shush and the Waste Ground Party, geographical locations, both of them were Dublin based or Leinster based tours. So the Arts Council felt that we weren't being sort of geographically ambitious enough. So as you can see, Sive and Quietly would have done better on that front. That feeds into reach. Literally the number of people it could potentially be seen by was very little, and which is sort of about value for money, which it's important to know the Arts Council do assess things in terms of value for money. If they're giving you €50,000, they want to know exactly how many people around the country, and not in a bums on seats way, but how many people is the art reaching, how many citizens are they serving by giving you that funding. So it's a very crude measurement, but it is something that they do, and something you should just consider. It doesn't apply to all work. I mean, some work, the audience is 3 people at a time, and that's perfectly fine, and if there's a reason for that, but that's important. Also, community education, we often include this in our applications, but it's usually very well thought through. We have a full-time community education department. One of the things I did with the Waste Ground Party is in not having the time to put it in the application. So this is the thing about, I mentioned it in the application form and then didn't back it up in my supporting documents or really explain what we meant. And we were criticized in our feedback about not really explaining what that was, and accused of kind of putting that in order to tick a box, but actually it wasn't well thought through. And that was very true. So, I mean, these things are very important, and sort of mentioning Flahulock things in the application can often go against you rather than make it look like you're thinking of everything. So, yeah.
It's Una here again. Just to reiterate what Lara was saying there, you're entitled to ask for feedback on your successful and unsuccessful applications. And anyone who does it, I think always finds it a really illuminating thing to see why did you get the money? And it's not always for the reasons that you might imagine. And then secondly, why did you not get the money? Can be really useful for your next application.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just have a few top tips listed there. It's all stuff I've mentioned already. The really, the thing I'd like to highlight there in that slide is the ask for advice. The Arts Council, the venues, other producers, and actually not mentioned there is resource organisations such as Arts Audiences, Theatre Forum, the Irish Theatre Institute, Dance Ireland. There are so many resource organisations, Visual Artists Ireland, who you can go to for advice and help. I mean, one of the things I did in order to build relationships with venues on a face-to-face basis, visit them is a big thing. I know Una was talking about that. But the other thing is attend all of the big meetings. There's conferences, there's monster meetings, there's venue managers meetings, there's different sort of coffee mornings. It's great to get to know people, and then you can ask for advice. So, I know the Arts Council very much are keen for people to ask them, because it diminishes the amount of misunderstandings and increases the likelihood of success. Also the venues, they're just a golden resource of information. They know everything about their audiences, and people have such great audience information and data collection at this stage. You know, Heather Maitland's trained us all so brilliantly that actually they really do know what they're talking about, especially about things like ticket yield. You know, some places know that is $13.50. There's nothing you can do about it. That is what it is, and they're right in my experience. So the other thing is call other producers. Just give them a bell on the phone and say, is this completely mad, this amount of money that I'm asking for? And the producer will either say to you, yes, you're mental, or no, you know, it's perfectly acceptable. So yeah,
Great.
just to say, oh, this one. Thanks, guys, and good luck with your applications.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Lara. I hope people have found that. Typically, when we do these workshops, people always say that the best part of it was hearing from somebody who's actually done it, and that was a really interesting and illuminating presentation. We have another question which has come in, and this came up when we did this yesterday too. It says, how do I find out about what venues might be suitable for my tour, particularly in Northern Ireland? So Lara, would you talk maybe a little bit about what venues, or how you might go about finding out what venues might be suitable for a tour?
Sure. There's a lot of information on venues, both on the Arts Council website and on the Irish Theatre Institute run websites. So literally just the listing about them. I also find that across the board, there are excellent websites of the venues themselves. So if you're able to get sort of a contact list of venues and then have a look at their websites and see, firstly, what are their literal physical dimensions and where are they, and then also what kind of thing they program. So if you're looking at doing just some initial research, there's a lot available where you don't have to talk to a person or commit to anything. In terms of initially trying to find out what the landscape is like, I would definitely again reiterate the resource organizations. So as Val said, Val knows them all. Give him a call. You know,
the other area I think that's really interesting is the networks, you know, where you and there's detail about all of the different venue networks on the Theatre Forum website, I know, but those networks work together to program and particularly to program tours, and so you can find out a lot about a particular network. They have come together because they have an interest in programming a particular kind of work, or because they're of a similar size, or for a variety of reasons. And so you can find out a lot about a lot of venues by being able to talk to somebody about a particular network.
And they have rolling chairs as well, the network. So if you find out, you know, NASC, Nomad, Strollers, Immel, they all have somebody who is a venue manager's appointed chair, and you can ring them and ask about the network. So that's quite useful.
Now, the question about how to find out about venues in Northern Ireland is a more difficult one, I think. And again, like I say, this did come up yesterday, but there wasn't really, I think, an amazingly satisfactory answer. Val was explaining that some venues in Northern Ireland are funded by the Arts Council of Northern Ireland, and some are local authority funded purely. And so there are kind of two different groups there. The best suggestion I heard was that you might contact Audiences Northern Ireland, Audiences NI, and go on their website in the first instance and see. I'm sure those venues are all members, and that they might be able to offer you some advice. But it's certainly something for us, and I know the Arts Council, to think about the next time the touring round comes around, because people, of course, will have an ambition to tour into Northern Ireland, but if you don't know how to begin to contact people and how to crack it, it can be tough enough. So I think that's something that we'll take on board and pass back on to the Arts Council. Okay, thank you all very much for joining in, those of you who were with us on Hangout and those of you who watched on YouTube. It's been a really interesting thing to do, and I think it's a really useful way of trying to get information and experience across to people, and we look forward to getting your feedback to see what you think about getting this kind of presentation when you can't actually see the person. And thank you very much again. The best of luck with your applications, and we will talk to you all very soon. Oh, lastly to say, Lara was just mentioning there about how there are meetings and, you know, things that you can go to. We're running our annual conference again on the 17th of December. It's called Focus on Audiences in Dublin Castle. And we are ramping up some of the networking elements of the conference this year. A lot of the feedback we got last year was, oh, we'd love more time to network. So I'm trying to come up with a sort of good format about how people might network about something as opposed to shaking hands and introducing themselves. So if you haven't already, go on artsaudiences.ie and see if the very strict Gillian Clark will let you register, and talk to you all soon. Thank you very much.